Hello, everybody, and welcome to this month's monthly presentation of the Institute for Historical Studies. First off, I'm pleased to announce that we are now have a full schedule for the rest of the year. We don't have one in December, but from now through November, we have a full slate. And all of 2026 is open, so if anybody would like to do a presentation then, you're welcome to do so. If anybody wants to take notes for this month's presentation for the newsletter, no volunteers. All right, Ted Atlas is speaking today on an interesting combination topic, football and technology, the essence of the Bay Area. Ted is a fourth generation Californian from San Jose, and worked for the Santa Clara County Sheriff's Department, and spent 36 years, which is amazing, at the San Francisco 49ers games. So he's published a history of the Candlestick Park Stadium, which I still refuse to call whatever it is now, besides it's not there anymore. And he continues to write and publish articles on historical interest. And he's going to talk today about how both football and technology display the essence of the Bay Area. So without further ado, Ted, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Okay, so this is kind of a long presentation. There's a lot of information, so I hope I don't lose any of you. This first slide here is actually 1869. There were two events that have bearing on this topic. On the left is the famous picture of the joining of the two railroads at Promontory Point, Utah on May 10th of that year, which obviously had a huge effect on California that now brought easy access both for freight and for people. And then the photo on the right there is the first football game, which occurred in New Jersey between Rutgers and Princeton. Hold on, everything was working, but there we go. All righty. So we sort of start our story with California, with the gold rush or the discovery of gold in 1848. And then it took about a year for the news to travel back east and people start coming. So the estimate in 1849 is about 80,000 people came. About half of them walked overland via the California Trail, which took 6 months, walk/carts or wagons. Half came by sea, either around the tip of South America, which took about 4 months, or crossing the Isthmus of Panama, which up until 1855 required traveling in canoes and across jungle trails, which took 8 weeks. And then they opened a railroad across the isthmus and shortened it to 6 weeks. But a grueling journey, to be sure. And also significantly in 1851, the first two colleges in California opened, both in Santa Clara, Santa Clara College, and then California Wesleyan College also started in Santa Clara. In 1864, the San Francisco and San Jose Railroad line opened. That was later purchased by Southern Pacific in 1870. The right-of-way that they use is still the same one that Caltrain uses, except from San Bruno to San Francisco. It shifted closer to the bay. It used to be farther to the west. Also in that year, or excuse me, those years, 1859, you had St. Ignatius Academy in San Francisco was formed, as well as St. Mary's College. And California took advantage of the Morrill Land Grant Act, which is something that President Lincoln signed during this another Civil War legislation, just like the railroad, building the railroad was Civil War legislation. The Morrill Land Act gave states land if they would open universities or colleges that taught agriculture and mining, which we now would call engineering. So most of the A&Ms, or all the A&Ms around the country, are land grant colleges. In California, UC is our land grant college. So in 1869, we talked about a couple minutes ago, when the railroad was completed, you can see it shortened the trip to 7 days, and then the other modes of transportation took various lengths. But as you see, none of them were cheap. All the numbers in parentheses would be what that cost in 2025 dollars. So crossing the country was not just grueling, but it was expensive. But people continued to come in whatever ways they got here. In 1871, California Wesleyan College moved from Santa Clara to San Jose off the Alameda. It also allowed admitted women, so it became the first coeducational institution in the state. California State Normal School moved from San Francisco to San Jose to Fourth and San Fernando. It's now San Jose State University is in the same location. The University of California moved from Oakland to Berkeley. And most importantly, in technology-wise, on the right column, Dr. James Dawson and his wife and son had an abundance of fruit on their gardens on the Alameda at Taylor Street. He was a physician and he used that knowledge, and he adopted a way of canning and preserving fruit that had been used during the Civil War. His son Thomas was a tinsmith, so he was able to make cans. So they were able to pack fruit and preserve fruit in cans rather than jars. So it made it easier to ship, but less breakage and less weight and cheaper. They soon built a cannery at 5th and Julian Streets in San Jose, downtown San Jose. It was known as the San Jose Fruit Packing Company. That continued to grow over the years. We'll get back to them in a little bit. But that would really be the first, you might consider the first technology in the valley is canning fruit and drying fruit, preserving fruit. Well, that didn't work. Hold on, I'm sorry. Let me try to go back here a second. There we go. On June 3rd, 1878, in what's now part of the Stanford University campus, Eadweard Muybridge and an engineer from the Central Pacific Railroad lined up 12 cameras, each with a string attached to a shutter release, in order to capture the gait of a horse as it galloped past. When viewed using Muybridge's zoopraxiscope, the 12 frames made up the world's first motion picture. Muybridge's development and application of technology, which answered the question whether all 4 feet of a horse are off the ground at the same time, was a harbinger of what would become the most innovative region in the world. The significance of the fact that it was in behest of and financed by Leland Stanford cannot be underrated. The Silicon Valley and technological eras that preceded it would not have happened, that followed, excuse me, would not have happened without Stanford University and its alumni. So there's the horse, the 12 photos, and you can see that only one time that the third photo from the left, or the top 2 in the middle, are all 4 hooves off the ground. But you can see that's when they're underneath the horse rather than stretched out as artists always depicted horses with their legs stretched out and off the ground. That's not true. So college football really started growing at that first game in 1869, and it started spreading. And there's just a list of the colleges in our area and when they took on started football teams. In 1891, 550 students became the first class at Stanford University. It's pretty well known that Stanford University was named for Leland Stanford Jr., Leland and Jane Latham Stafford's son, who died when he was 16 of typhoid fever while they were on a trip to Europe. They took their 8,000-acre stock farm in Palo Alto, and that's established the endowment. That and some other land up in Butte County and other parts of the state are the endowment that Stanford University is based on. But in the first season, the first year, they also started playing football. They hired Walter Camp, who's known as the father of American football, as the coach. He'd invented the line of scrimmage and a system of downs. And among the first class, one of the students was Herbert Hoover. He claims to be the very first student, as he's the first one who moved into the dorm. But he was also the manager of the football team. And then the next year, they played the first of what's become known as the big game between Stanford and Cal. That game was in San Francisco. That's San Jose Fruit Packing Company. There's their cannery. Actually, that's their cannery west of downtown San Jose, which over the years became the largest fruit canning facility in the world. So this is a simple home spark transmitter that teenage boys and young men built on their own from kits or parts they could gather together, and got into wireless radio. It later became known as ham radio. Actually, the term radio wasn't even used yet, but it was wireless, and then then radio, and then ham radio is amateur radio. So this really engaged the enthusiasm of boys and men, young men of all ages and all economic classes. And they started also having, ship to shore stuff. And so teenage boys could listen in this radio traffic as it went back and forth between the land and ships at sea. But really, one significant event in 1899 is what really moved things forward. So it's at that time between the Spanish-American War and the Philippine-American War, the California volunteers were returning home on the Sherman, which was an Army transport. And they knew approximately when they were going to arrive, but they wanted to celebrate this victory. It was the first. We won't get into the whole politics of the Philippine War and the Spanish-American War and taking of the Philippines. That's a whole nother subject matter somebody else can cover. But there was a lot of excitement. It was really the first foreign war the United States had been involved in, with the Spanish-American War, both in the ones in the Caribbean and the ones in the Philippines. So there was a lot of excitement that the California men were coming home. And so they placed equipment and an operator on the lightship, which is about 9 miles off the entrance to the bay, and awaited the ship. And when they saw it, they sent a teletype or a wireless message to people at the Cliff House that the ship had arrived. It was the first ship-to-shore message ever sent in the United States, and the first time that wireless telegraphy was used to report news. Actually, the ship didn't enter the harbor till the next day because of fog. But this is the same era when Marconi is, quote, inventing things, but other people are doing similar. Certainly Marconi gets the credit, and he was the first. But other people were doing similar things at a similar time. And then also one of the problems with college football in the early years is because they didn't have as many rules and penalties, there was a significant injury and death rate. And so colleges started dropping football right around the turn of the century. Also in 1902, 14-year-old Francis McCarty, who lived in San Francisco, he and his brother perfected a way of modulating or superimposing speech on a spark-generated radio wave, and they were able to send that across Stowe Lake in Golden Gate Park, which nobody was doing. I mean, the Marconi is teletype. The stuff we talked about with the Sherman, and that was teletype. These guys are doing voice, wireless voice, which we now do every day. That was a big thing. So he raised capital. Remember, he's 14 years old. He raised capital and started the McCarty Wireless Telephone Company in San Francisco. Kind of the first of what Silicon Valley became known of as young, generally men. There are more women now, but for a long time was just men who had a hobby and then turned it into a business. So President Roosevelt did convene a meeting to discuss rules to make football safer. And not only out of that, did they came up with the downfield pass, which really didn't get used for years, but ended up in the rule book. And what became known as the NCAA, the National Collegiate Athletic Association, was formed during those meetings. Unfortunately, in 1906, Francis McCarty was living in Oakland because their house had been destroyed in the 1906 earthquake and fire, and his horse-drawn wagon overturned and his head struck a telephone pole, and he was killed. Somewhat irony there that a guy working on wireless telephone was killed when his head hit a telephone pole. His mother gave the work to a friend of his by the name of Charles Logwood. We'll hear his name again in a few minutes. Cal Stanford had also, they suspended playing football until 1918, so they didn't play in the early decades of the century. 1909, things are really starting to move forward in electronics. Excuse me. Charles Doc Herhold established the first radio station in the country. It was in the Garden City Bank at the corner of First and San Fernando Streets in downtown San Jose. He had a regular schedule of broadcasting farm news and other things. You had to really have a home-built set to get it. I mean, it didn't go very far, but it did get out across the valley. And his wife went to the local record store and borrowed records and played them. So it's kind of the first time that music was being broadcast in a scheduled format. And when they started issuing radio call signs, and they chose Q for west of the Mississippi and W's for east, Herhold Station was given KQW in 1929, and then in 1949 it became KCBS and later moved to San Francisco. So KCBS radio really can trace its roots all the way back to 1909. It's one of the oldest stations. That, and I think KDKA in Pennsylvania are two of the oldest stations in the country. Charles Logwood, that friend of McCarty's who had his work, gave him to Cyril Elwell, who was a recent Stanford electrical engineering alum, who worked on it, but he decided that he understood that to transmit voice, you needed something better than a spark. You needed an arc, a more continuous media, excuse me. So he was aware of work that Valdemar Poulsen had done in Denmark. And so Elwell went to Denmark and he bought the rights to the Poulsen arc generator system. And he had the rights for it in the United States. And when he got back to Palo Alto, he showed it to the first president of Stanford. It was David Starr Jordan, who gave him money. He gave him $500 and got another professor to do it. So it's the first time that Stanford University was investing venture capital in an electronics firm. And the Poulsen Wireless Telephone and Telegraph Company was founded in that year in a space that they gave him on the Stanford campus. So the arc systems were able to transmit over greater distances, and in all hours of the day. Sparks were limited to certain hours in atmospherics, and it was much superior to the equipment that Marconi was producing. Poulsen is really the first Silicon Valley company. We'll hear their name quite a bit in the next few minutes, but they were those kind of quintessential Silicon Valley company. It started by Stanford alum, engineering alum, with venture capital from Stanford. They maintain their relationship with Stanford University. There's companies that spin off, or people who work for Federal go on and start their own companies. Some of them were very successful. They're disruptors. They're changing the way that radio or wireless is transmitted from spark to arc. So they are really the quintessential and very first Silicon Valley company. They've soon moved off of Stanford campus to this house there in the picture, in the upper picture, at 917 Emerson, at the corner of Emerson and Channing in Palo Alto. And Elwell went out in order to finance the company and engaged powerful investors in San Francisco to invest, and they changed the name to Federal Telegraph Company. And among those investors were William Crocker, who's the son of Charles Crocker, one of the big four of the Central Pacific Railroad, and E.W. Hopkins was the nephew of Mark Hopkins, another one of the big four. So you've got two descendants of the big four, and Stanford University, which is from one of the big four, so very much involved. So the railroad has its fingers out in lots of different things, as we know well, that not all of it was good in the history of the Southern Pacific Railroad, but these were positives. So 1910, William Randolph Hearst, who owned the San Francisco Examiner and the Los Angeles Examiner, sponsored a famous international air meet in Los Angeles And then 2 weeks later, did it again at Tanforan Park, which was a racetrack in San Bruno. It's now a shopping center, shopping mall. 100,000 people showed up in that first day. That top picture there is Louis Paulhan, who's a famous French flyer, and he's flying over Tanforan. If you kind of can see here on the hillside, if you know South San Francisco, up on the hillside in concrete letters, they have South San Francisco. I think it used to say the industrial city. That's not what it says there. Those are actually an advertisement encouraging the people who are planning the 1915 Panama Pacific exhibition to locate the fairgrounds in South San Francisco. They had not yet chosen the fairgrounds that were later at the marina in on the San Francisco Bay. So they were politicking, and that's what those words were there on the hillside. Down in the lower left, there is Earl Enos, who was another early adopter of wireless. He had a business in the Grant Building in San Francisco on Market Street. He sold equipment to the public, and he also had a news service where he transmitted news from his office in San Francisco to ships at sea. But he was the first to do that. And in 1910, on one of those days of the air meet, not when there were a lot of people there, but during that time period, took his radio equipment and put it on an airplane. And while airborne, the pilot tapped out a few dots and dashes on the radio set, which Enos heard on the ground. And unfortunately, he had no media there to document it, but it's well remembered by his fiance and whatnot. It's really the first time there was an air to ground radio message sent, but it's not documented, so it doesn't really get credit for that. The next year, they had another air meet in January, again at Tanforan, from the 7th of January to the 26th. The military used that as the time to test airplanes and airborne radio. Army Lieutenant Paul Beck, who was a strong proponent of aviation for scouting and combat and was the fourth person to get his wings in the Army, was in charge of the meet. And that's him there in the right there. He's holding a box that says Western Wireless Equipment Company on it. It's a 28-pound transmitter. Philip Parmalee is the pilot, and that's a Wright airplane that they're flying. They took off, and Beck typed out some transmissions that not only were heard at Tanforan, but also 40 miles away in San Jose. An infantry unit established a camp there at Tanforan during this meet. It was named for, it was called Camp Selfridge, and Selfridge Field was the airstrip. It was the honor of Thomas E. Selfridge, who was a native of San Francisco and a graduate of West Point, and actually was in the same class with Douglas MacArthur. He took part in the early stage of Army aviation, and he was aboard a Wright flyer being piloted by Orville Wright. That's them down there in the lower left. That plane crashed. Selfridge was killed. Wright was not, but Selfridge became the first person to die in an air crash. Also during that air meet, the Navy, not to be left out, I'm sorry, the Army also used, it was the first time they used an airplane to spot and photograph troops from the air. And also they bombed troops, bombed in quotes, not really bombed them. The pilot in that airplane was Myron Crissy. His brother, who was an Army pilot, was killed in 1919, is Dana Crissy, and that's whom Crissy Field at the Presidio is named for. Like I said, the Navy, not to be left out, took the USS Pennsylvania, and they took it to Mare Island, and they put a flight deck on it with arresting wires, cables, and attached to sandbags. And the pilot, Eugene Ely, that's him in the lower right there. He had taken off from a plane at Norfolk earlier. This time he both landed and took off from the ship that's anchored there in San Francisco Bay. And that is what the Navy points to as the beginning of naval aviation. Excuse me. Unfortunately, Ely was killed 9 months later, just 2 days short of his 25th birthday in a crash in Georgia. Philip Parmalee, this pilot over here, He died a year later in a crash in Yakima. Flying was not for the, it was for the meek. It was very, very dangerous. Lieutenant Beck here, who was a pilot, did not die in an airplane crash, but rather was killed by a jealous husband in Oklahoma City by a man who was an oilman and a former member of the Oklahoma Superior Court, who thought he was having an affair with his wife. The Army ruled it to be in the line of duty, and so he was buried with full honors at Arlington. Just a little side note there. It's 1911, Federal Telegraph established a wireless service to compete with Western Union and others that were getting into that business in the West, all through the West Coast and as far east as El Paso, and also to Hawaii. And they built a station on Ocean Beach in San Francisco to transmit those messages. They also began selling equipment to the Navy. Picture there, in 1908, Lee DeForest was an inventor working in New York, and he was the first person to put a third element into a vacuum tube between the cathode and the anode. And because it's this kind of little zigzaggy thing over here, it reminded him, he called it a grid because it reminded him of the gridiron of a football field, the lines on a football field. And Cyril Elwell is not only did he have the rights to the Polson arc equipment, but he had the rights to this first magnetic recording device in the world, which Federal Telegraph used to record incoming messages at 300 words a minute. So it was, they recorded them and then had to slow it down in order for them to be transcribed. So DeForest, he left New York and he came to San Francisco, and then a year later, 1912, went to work for Federal in Palo Alto. And he and two other men, Charles Logwood and Van Etten, Harold Van Etten, I'm sorry, were working. They're trying to invent an amplifier so that signal that's on that wire, they need to amplify it so they can hear it and transcribe. And so they wired multiple Odeon tubes together in a cascade and were able to amplify sound and also generate electromagnetic waves. Was sort of a side thing they didn't expect. And it proved that a vacuum tube could be used both as an amplifier and an oscillator. And if you can tune that oscillator to a certain frequency, you can then create a frequency to transmit on electromagnetic wave. And that discovery of vacuum tubes and that use became the basis of all electronics for the next 40 years. Radio, later television, early computers, everything used those tubes that DeForest and those two men there had perfected in this lab on Emerson Street in Palo Alto. And that's the three men down there and Mrs. Longwood. 1912, the S&A Film Company of Chicago established a movie studio in Niles in what's now Fremont, up against the hills. They filmed Bronco Billy Westerns there, and Charles Chaplin shot a number of his movies there before they moved to Southern California. Frederick Terman, we'll hear his name quite a bit in the next couple minutes, and Herbert Hoover Jr. both lived on the Stanford campus. Terman's father was a professor of educational psychology at Stanford. If you know the Stanford-Binet IQ tests, Dr. Terman was the Stanford side of those. He took Binet's work and expanded upon it. Unfortunately, Dr. Terman has fallen in quite disfavor because he was a strong proponent of eugenics. But his son went on to, is really the father of the Silicon Valley. We'll talk about him as we go along here. But it just proves it. And then Herbert Hoover Jr. Also had a career in radio, in aviation radio. And William Shockley moved with his parents to Palo Alto. We'll talk about him in about 40 years later when he invented the transistor and then came back into the semiconductor business. But he lived very close to DeForest in downtown Palo Alto for a little bit of time. Obviously, they were quite a bit different in ages. So DeForest, even though DeForest Lee DeForest was working for Federal at the time that he found out the capabilities of his Audion tube. Federal did not own the patent rights. And so DeForest sold those to AT&T. And in 1915, they made the first coast-to-coast long-distance call where the Audion uses it. The signal only goes so far, and then it has to be amplified so it can continue farther across country. So the first one took place between New York with Alexander Graham Bell calling Thomas Watson in San Francisco at the Pacific Panama exhibition. And that one point there over here where they spliced the wires, they called that the golden splice, just like we had the golden spike for railroad in the same area. The picture lower left there are Allen and Malcolm Lougheed, who gave rides in their Alco Hydro airplane, which they built in San Francisco. That's during the 1915 Panama Pacific Exhibition. They were giving rides. It's also the first biplane where the propeller is in front of the wings instead of behind them. They renamed their company Lougheed Aircraft Manufacturing and moved to Santa Barbara. That business went out of business due to financial, but was reformed in 1926 when Allen hired Jack Northrop as an airplane designer, and they respelled the name of the company to Lockheed. So that's where Lockheed Aircraft Company started. Malcolm, his brother, had patents for hydraulic braking systems for cars, which he sold to Duesenberg. So two very clever inventors who grew up where Lexington Reservoir now is and above Los Gatos. They lived in the town there of Alma, which is now underwater. Federal moved from that little house on Emerson Street, there was a couple little houses, over to Alma Street between the railroad tracks and El Camino Real. They were selling quite a bit of equipment to the Navy, and so they needed more space, and that's where they moved to. Here's some of the startups, the ones in green. The men who started those worked at Federal and then started their own companies. Many went into the vacuum tube business, which it was hard to build vacuum tubes that didn't infringe on other people's patents, General Electric and Westinghouse and AT&T, but they managed a way to do it. So all these companies were all startups in the Bay Area in the 1920s and 30s. Some of them went on to be quite successful over the years. Some of them still exist in small parts. IMAC, Itel McCullough is still part of Varian. So you can see this whole pattern, what we think was a modern post-war Silicon Valley thing, is it's actually been going on for quite a long time. Let's kind of get back to football here. We'll go through this line by line. Maybe most significantly, the 1920 in Canton, Ohio, that a group of men met in a Hupmobile dealership, and they formed the American Professional Football Association, which in 1922 was renamed the National Football League. St. Mary's College was down to only 71 students, so in order to try to get interest in it, they hired Ed Slip Madigan as the coach. He had played for Knute Rockne in Notre Dame. So he came here and took on the St. Mary's Gales. Stanford built their stadium. Actually, Stanford heard that Cal was building a stadium. They jumped in and 4 months built the original Stanford Stadium at 60,000 seats. It was the second largest stadium in the country. College of Pacific left San Jose. I'm sorry, California Wesleyan College became College of the Pacific. They were in San Jose. 1923, they moved to Stockton, and the place where their campus became Bellarmine College Prep, still there. And there's Memorial Stadium in Berkeley. Stanford hired Glenn Warner, Pop Warner, who was a very innovative coach, and he also invented equipment for football, shoulder pads and thigh pads, and he founded the Pop Warner Little Scholars Youth Football Organization, which still exists. And then San Francisco got a gift from $100,000 from the estate of Mary Kezar and built Kezar Stadium in the very east end of Golden Gate Park in the Panhandle along Stanton Street. And butts up into the Haight-Ashbury neighborhood. Over the years, the 49ers and the Raiders had a home game, played their games there, as well as USF, St. Mary's, Santa Clara, the East-West Shrine game, high school games, and other sporting events. In 1925, Notre Dame made their first appearance, their only appearance in the Rose Bowl. It's kind of an interesting story. They're coached by Knute Rockne, and it featured the Four Horsemen. Stanford was led by Ernie Nevers, a famous halfback. On their trip west, there was a lot of objection that Cal and USC and some of the other teams in the conference didn't want Notre Dame. They had a reputation for poor academics and the suspicion that some of their players were paid professionals. But they came out here, and Knute Rockne used the train trip out to Pasadena to really promote his team. Notre Dame won the game. And then the team, Rockne wasn't with him, but the team came up to San Francisco, and then they came down for lunch at Villa Montalvo in Saratoga at Senator James Phelan's summer estate in Saratoga. That's the picture there on the right. Ernie Nevers left Stanford and was signed by the Duluth Eskimos in the NFL. The 200-meter band in radio, what's called the shortwave band, was not thought to be very good, and so the government let amateurs have it. Turned out that shortwave in the 100-meter band is one of the best for being transmitted with very little power over great distances, and so you got much smaller equipment. So it became especially helpful on airplanes where you didn't have, where weight was a consideration of equipment. So a lot of the first radio equipment, or much of the radio equipment in airplanes for years, operated in the shortwave band or in the 100-meter band shortwaves. Those women down there are packing fruit, apricots at the John Leonard Packing House on Wolf Road in Cupertino. That land in the 1960s was bought by Hewlett Packard, and then in the 2010s was bought by Apple and is now Apple Park. So what was Apricot Orchards is now the headquarters for Apple Company. But they were packing apricots there not that long ago. 1927, Philo Farnsworth was working in a small lab on Green Street in San Francisco, and he was the first to have an all-electronic transmission of an image, which we call television. So that was invented in a building that still stands. It's still there in San Francisco. He moved his company to Philadelphia and sold out to Philco. The names are only coincidental that they're both Phil. The dressed down and free-thinking Californians didn't fit well into the East Coast culture. And television didn't really do much, didn't really take off till post-war, but was invented in San Francisco. St. Mary's moved out to Moraga, where they still are. The Food Machinery Corporation was formed by a merger of a couple companies. They became the largest food canning equipment company in the world. And Ed Slip Madigan took his St. Mary's team back to New York to play Fordham, which was another Catholic college, a football powerhouse. And their offensive line, actually their line, because they played both ways, were called the 7 Blocks of Granite. And one of those blocks was Vince Lombardi. And there's Madigan and Babe Ruth. He invited Babe Ruth to the game. And St. Ignatius College changed their name to USF, although St. Ignatius is still the prep school. I also missed in there, but David Packard and William Hewlett met trying out for Pop Warner's football team at Stanford. David Packard made it. He was pretty tall. He's about 6'4". Bill Hewlett did not make the team. So during World War I, the Navy used Federal arc transmitters to build the most powerful radio station near Bordeaux, France, and then ordered two more 1,000-watt kilowatt arc generators from Federal to be deployed at a transmitting station in North Carolina. At the end of World War I, they canceled that, but the castings and the copper and all, which had already been delivered to Federal in Palo Alto, that's where they're working on it there at the Federal plant in Palo Alto. They went into storage. And in 1921, Federal got a contract with the Chinese government to build 5 wireless telegraphy stations to communicate from China to the U.S. West Coast. The Japanese government objected, claiming that the Mitsui company had already had a contract, and so Federal dropped their contract. It never happened, and those pieces of equipment remained in storage. We'll get back to those in a minute. Leonard Fuller, who was the chief engineer of Federal Telegraph in the 20s, left, and he went to Cal to teach electrical engineering. And he often dined in the faculty club, where he became friends with Dr. Ernest O. Lawrence, who was a physics professor. And Lawrence told him that he was working on a proton merry-go-round, which was a circular particle accelerator, which later became known as the cyclotron. The cyclotron uses a magnetic field to boost the energy of whirling particles and then fire them towards a target at such high speed that the nuclei break or split the atom. His first cyclotron was very elementary. It was only 5 inches and could produce 80,000 electron volts. He was interested in making a bigger one. And Fuller said, well, he had this generator he could give him. And so they rewired one of those generators that had been sitting in storage at Federal that was supposed to go to China. Japan said no. They just sat there, and then one got sent over to Berkeley to Dr. Lawrence, and he used that 85-ton magnet to build a 27-inch cyclotron, which was then increased to a 37-inch. That's Dr. Lawrence there working on the 37-inch with the tops off it. He used that 37-inch cyclotron to produce technetium, which was the first artificial element, and to magnetically separate uranium-235, which was later a key component in the Manhattan Project. In a 1937 article in Time, Dr. Lawrence said that getting the Federal magnet was one of the 2 luckiest breaks he had in his research project. Oops, let me go back. Sorry. Cyclotrons were housed up there in the radiation lab at Berkeley. That later became the basis of the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. And among the colleagues who worked with him there was J. Robert Oppenheimer. Matter of fact, General Groves, who headed up the Manhattan Project, met Oppenheimer at that lab and then later recruited him to run the project. Down there in the bottom picture, the set designers recreated that magnet on a set for the production of the movie Oppenheimer. So there you have Josh Hartnett, who plays Dr. Lawrence, and Cillian Murphy is Dr. Oppenheimer. So that same piece of equipment was recreated for the movie a couple years ago, the Best Picture of the Year movie. They continued to expand the size of the cyclotrons at the Berkeley Radiation Lab. Even though they didn't use that generator for that, he used the magnet to build the first Calutron at the radiation lab, which they then recreated in mass numbers at Oak Ridge, Tennessee during the Manhattan Project, where thousands of young women were used to operate these Calutrons 24 hours a day to produce the 140 pounds of U-235, which was just enough for the Trinity test in New Mexico, and then as the fissionable material in the little boy bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima. So really, if you follow the story here, you have these Federal equipment, a Federal magnet that Lawrence uses to get to the point where they could use U-235 in a bomb, and along with his workers, which is then used on Japan. So in some ways, they sort of brought on their own demise by objecting to it being used in China. That magnet was well traveled, but post-war it went down to UCLA, where it was used to study the nature of matter and for working on radioisotopes for medical research. It came back to Berkeley, and there it is sitting in front of the Lawrence Hall of Science on the Berkeley campus. You get back a little bit of football here. That's a patent that Glenn Warner got while he was at Stanford on shoulder pads. In 1936, Lawrence Buck Shaw was hired as the coach of Santa Clara football team. He also had played for Knute Rockne and was a lineman blocking for George Gipp in those famous era of Notre Dame football. And he did quite well with Santa Clara Broncos. And then Sigurd Varian, who was a pilot for Pan American Airlines, he and his brother Russell had lived in Palo Alto when their father taught at Stanford. Both of them became engineers, but Sigurd was also a pilot. Because of the flying in difficult weather in the Latin America, he figured he wanted a way to develop all weather navigation system using microwaves. So he and his brother worked on it, and then sought the assistance of William Hansen, who was it was a professor now at Stanford and had been Russell Varian's roommate at Stanford. He suggested using a Rumpatron tube to sweep the sky using ultra short waves or microwaves, which were then reflected back and then displayed on a phosphorus screen, which Philo Farnsworth had invented and Russell had worked with him. And that's what radar is. So these guys were working on radar, unbeknownst to them that the British were also working on it. The British are the ones who get credit for inventing radar, but these guys were working on it at the same time in Palo Alto. Stanford gave them lab space to work on it. And they invented the klystron tube. Actually, Russell Varian invented the klystron tube. And that's kind of just another description there of radar. Also, Stanford owned part of that patent. Over the years, Stanford made $2 million off the patent of the klystron. In 1939, the NACA, which is the National Advisory Committee on Aeronautics, the predecessor to NASA, established the research laboratory adjacent to Moffett Field in Mountain View. They wanted it one day's journey from all the aircraft manufacturers in Southern California, so the engineers wouldn't just drop in. And so that's how Ames Research Center came to be next to Moffett Field. And David Packard and William Hewlett, who had been engineering students of Dr. Terman's, started their company in a garage in Palo Alto, the house that David Packard rented. Their first product was a oscillator. Their first sale was 8 of those to the Disney company, who was just in production and starting to distribute Fantasia. Fantasia was recorded in what we would now call multi-channel stereo and called Fantasound. And so in the big theaters in big cities, they would set up this sound system with RCA, and they used the Hewlett-Packard tone oscillators to calibrate their equipment. I had to throw this picture in. This is a great picture of the Geary Theater in San Francisco. Obviously, Geary Street went in the other direction in those days. But you can see there, it says Stokowski, who was the composer who wrote the music for Fantasia and conducted it in Fantasound. So I thought that was a great picture of the theater. So there it is. There's the klystron tube. Sperry bought it. Varians worked for him. The British used it in their night fighters to be able to see German planes. And it was very much a contribution to the Battle of Britain, in winning the Battle of Britain. The the San Jose State football team was in Hawaii on December 7th of 1941 and got stuck there for a number of weeks. And so they went to work and helped the Honolulu police protect or patrol. And then finally were able to get home. Dr. Terman was recruited back to the Harvard Radio Research Lab. He headed it. They spent the war trying to defeat German anti-aircraft measures, including coming up with chaff, which were strips of foil which were dropped to confuse radar. 1943, IBM came to San Jose with a punch card factory in downtown San Jose. Stanley Hiller was one of the very early researchers of helicopters. That's him testing a helicopter in Memorial Stadium at Berkeley. Apparently, they had no risk management in those days. So here you go. Let's go test it. After the war, Terman came back to Stanford and he established the Stanford Electronics Research Laboratory. He started producing lots of engineers that started up companies post-war. And he also led the effort to establish the Stanford Research Institute in Menlo Park. It used to be part of Stanford University in the 1970s. They divested it because students were objecting to their work for the government. They came up with a number of things. They were the ones who decided that Disneyland should be in Anaheim and not Burbank, where Walt wanted it. And among the other things over the years that they developed was a voice recognition engine, which Apple bought and just kept the name of Siri. So Siri is really a variation of SRI. Post-war, things are really moving forward into aerospace. Westinghouse, the Joshua Hendy was bought by Westinghouse, became Westinghouse Marine. They make propulsion systems and launch tubes, all the ballistic missiles, every ballistic missile that the Navy has ever had, starting with Polaris, Poseidon, Trident. They've all been made by Lockheed and Sunnyvale, and they've all been in launch tubes made by Westinghouse Marine and now Northrop Grumman and Sunnyvale. And Hewlett-Packard incorporated and started their company, and they're very important in especially in the what became known as the HP way of doing things, which most importantly maybe was Casual Friday. Casual Friday began at Hewlett-Packard because Friday was the day they shipped product and everybody lent a hand. And so they were told, just wear your casual clothes. You don't need to wear your white shirt and tie on Fridays. And that's where Casual Friday began. Varian Associates, so the Varian brothers came back to the area and they formed their company, Varian Associates. Among the things, the klystron tube is used for, if you ever got an MRI, thank the Varians, because the klystron tube is what is used in an MRI machine. The Ampex Corporation, which was started by a Russian engineer, Alexander M. Panayatov, who used his name as initials. The U.S. government had taken German plans for tape machines. They took it as war reparations. An engineer from Ampex saw it, and they got the rights to it, and they built the first magnetic tape recorder in Redwood City, and it was used by Bing Crosby. He's the first one to time shift. He recorded his show so that he didn't have to do it twice. So it played once in the East and once in the West. So he invested quite a bit in the company. And also in 1949, the 49ers were formed and they played their first game in the 1950 season against the New York Yanks, team which lasted about a year. They were in the All-American Conference. They weren't, the NFL was not interested in expansion. And so 𝘛𝘦𝘤𝘁𝘐𝑚𝘠, the founder of the 49ers, and 7 other men started their own conference called the All-American Conference. And in 1951, the USF team went undefeated. They were invited to the Orange Bowl in Miami. They had 2 black players on the team. And the people in Miami said, "You're all welcome except for the 2 black guys." And the players voted and they said, either we all go or none of us go. And they didn't go. So they wouldn't relent. So, and unfortunately, the next year at USF stopped. They were in financial difficulties and they dropped football after that. But 4 men on that team are in the Pro Football Hall of Fame. It's the only team in the history of college football that has 4 players in the Pro Football Hall of Fame. So that's pretty good for a small, what was still an all-men's college in San Francisco. IBM opened a research facility at 99 Notre Dame Street in downtown San Francisco, downtown San Jose. San Francisco passed a bond issue to build a multi-purpose stadium that later became Candlestick Park. And Bill Walsh graduated from San Jose State. It's 1956. Ampex was the first to invent a videotape machine, which is that there they are. They cost $75,000 each in those days. And the first CBS bought them and used it for the evening news. That became the first show to be time shifted. In that picture there, the man third from the left here is Ray Dolby. He left to start his own company, Dolby Labs. William Shockley, that young boy who lived in Palo Alto in the early part of the century, came back to the Bay Area. He had been working for Bell Labs, where he and 2 other men invented the transistor. He came back here because his mother was sick and she needed better weather. So he set up Shockley Semiconductor in Mountain View. He was a terrible manager, great engineer, brilliant scientist, but a terrible manager. Down at that building on 99 Notre Dame Street in San Jose, they invented the world's first hard drive, 305 Ramac computer. That's IBM. That's it there in the picture. That does 5 megabytes of data. So about what 1 picture in your phone is. That's stored on those 24-inch, those 50 24-inch platters. And IBM established their plant in South San Jose. These are some famous, a lot of things happened in 57. 𝘛𝘦𝘤𝘁𝘰𝘵𝘐𝑚𝑒𝑚 died. It was the owner of the 49ers, he and his brother. Douglas Engelbart worked for SRI and then for Xerox PARC. He invented the bitmap screen, the mouse, hypertext, and the graphical user interface. 8 young scientists left Shockley because, like I said, he was a brilliant scientist, terrible manager. He referred to him as the traitorous 8. They got financing from Sherman Fairchild, who owned various Fairchild companies in New York, and they established Fairchild Semiconductor. Lockheed bought their land south of Moffett Field, 275 acres, and moved their Missiles and Space Division from Burbank up here. They actually were already in Palo Alto with a smaller facility. General Electric came to town, and Philco also came here. So all these big Eastern companies started to come to the valley. Things are happening out here, and they all want to be part of it. So they have this big Sylvania, Philco, GE, and others came here. Philco Western Development Laboratories was bought by Ford and became Philco Ford. Then Ford Aerospace, later Space Systems, the RAL. They still exist, only they just go by SSL now. 1960, the Oakland Seniors were founded as one of the original teams in the American Football League. Within a week, they changed their name to the Oakland Raiders. They're owned by a group of men and played their first games in Kezar Stadium in San Francisco. There was no stadium in Oakland. Most importantly, Fairchild Semiconductor built a circuit with 4 transistors on a single wafer of silicon, thereby becoming the first silicon integrated circuit. Texas Instruments also had a patent for integrated circuit, but they used germanium, and it was later decided that silicon was a better for that, and that became the standard. The Apollo guidance computers, which flew on Apollo 11, had 2,800 improved versions of that circuit that operated the guidance computers on the Apollo project. There we go here. So Lockheed, I don't know why that's cut off at the top there. I apologize, but so Lockheed had a contract from CIA, and they used this Hiller Aviation building on Willow Road in it says Palo Alto, but it's actually now Menlo Park, as a cover for the Corona Photo Reconnaissance Project. So very briefly, as but knows, the U-2s were flying over Russia and taking photographs, and Khrushchev complained to Eisenhower, said you can't do that anymore. So they came up with this idea of using cameras in satellites to take pictures. And actually the U-2 that was shot down with Gary Francis Powers, that was the last flight. It was going to be the last flight. And they were replacing it with these satellites, but they didn't have the ability in those days to use telemetry to take the photograph and, send the signal back to Earth and reconstruct it. So they actually had film cameras. And so they would fly over Russia or pass over Russia, taking thousands of photographs onto film. When the film roll was used up, these are pretty good size, they would fall into a capsule. It would be released from the satellite and dropped over the Pacific Ocean, and then a C-119 Air Force plane would fly along and grab it out of midair. Pretty amazing. I mean, it took them a few times to get it right, but they did. So they could do that twice, and then they had to put up another satellite because they obviously didn't have unlimited film. And so they did about 140 of those Corona satellites. And Lockheed was the prime contractor to put those together, but it was a black project for the CIA. So they actually used this building that had been Hiller Aviation to do that in. It's very, very interesting. And later the satellites got better and they didn't have to use film anymore. In 1964, so Tony Morabito died of a heart attack during a game in 1957. His brother died of a heart attack in 1964. Their wives ended up with the teams. They became the first women owners of a sports team in the United States. Kaiser Engineers of Oakland developed the Mission Control Center, the Manned Space Center in Houston, now the Johnson Space Center. So that mission control that you saw in the movie Apollo 13 and whatnot was designed by Kaiser Engineers in Oakland. It was built in Palo Alto by Philco and then set up in Houston. It was quite advanced. It's the first time they used computers or used cathode ray screens to show computer output in real time. By 1966, Al Davis left the Raiders. He'd taken ownership. He was a short time. He was the commissioner of the NFL, but when the leagues merged, he was out and he came back to the Raiders. So Fairchild Semiconductor, which was started by those 8 traders, people started leaving them, starting their own companies. And then eventually there were 65 companies in the Silicon Valley that all came out of Fairchild Semiconductor. They're called the Fairchildren. Intel's the most famous of those. In 1969, there was a one-word message sent from a computer at UCLA to SRI in the first test of a RapNet, which is the beginning of the internet. So the first internet message was sent from Los Angeles and received in Menlo Park. 1971 is the first time this term Silicon Valley was used. It's also the year that the Intel 404 first computer on the chip was made. Intel, like I said, they were men who left Fairchild and started their own company. And also in 1971, a friend introduced Steve Wozniak and Steve Jobs, who were both enthusiasts in electronics and ham radio. There's Pong. That was Atari. That's the first video game. That was in Mountain View. The Apple I went on sale. That was built in a garage at Steve Jobs' house, his parents' house in Los Altos. And three men left Ampex, including Larry Ellison, and started the company that became known as Oracle. Also in 1977, Edward DeBartolo Sr. bought the 49ers from the Morabito wives for $17 million. They just recently sold part of it for $500 million. It's worth about $9 billion now. Still in the same family. It's just different generation. There's the 8086 microprocessor. If you had your early PC, probably that's what it was in operating it. Also 1978, Eddie DeBartolo Jr. hired Bill Walsh as his coach. The Bradley fighting vehicle was developed in San Jose by Food Machinery Corporation on land which is now PayPal Park Soccer Stadium. The Raiders won the Super Bowl that year. 1982, two men left to form Electronic Arts. It's also the famous year of the Stanford band running on the field at Berkeley during big game and getting run over. The guy in the trombone there is run over by a Cal player at the end of the game. Interesting, the quarterback for Stanford that year was John Elway. Also 1982, the 49ers played their first Super Bowl game after winning the NFC Championship game with the catch. They defeated the Bengals. That was also the first time that Pat Summerall and John Wooden worked together on CBS. And the first time the telestrator was used. 1984, Steve Jobs, Apple ran the commercial, the Big Blue commercial, directed by Ridley Scott, to launch the Macintosh computer. That was during Super Bowl 18. It's the first time that a high production commercial was made specifically for Super Bowls. So Steve Jobs, for all his other things, the ideas he came up with, the specialized Super Bowl commercial is another Steve Jobs idea. And Electronic Arts tried to get Joe Montana to be on their football game. He already had a contract with Atari, and so they contracted with John Madden. And it's still Madden football. Adobe Systems launched Photoshop in 1989. Stanford or Santa Clara stopped playing football. Yahoo was developed. And so in 1996, Google began, and another company that started in a garage. And the Raiders moved back from Los Angeles to Oakland. 1997, after leaving the company, being forced out of the company some years earlier, Steve Jobs came back to CEO as the interim CEO. He obviously stayed as CEO till his cancer caused them to quit, and their stock was selling at $4 a share when he came back. 2005, they tore down the old Stanford Stadium and rebuilt a 50,000 seat stadium in the same footprint, a more modern, kind of like a mini NFL stadium. 2010, they tore down the western side of Cal because the Hayward Fault runs right through the stadium. A lot of it was not stable, and so they had to rebuild it, but they kept the stadium in the same place. And in 2012, the 49ers broke ground on Levi Stadium and moved out of Candlestick, with the intention of moving out of Candlestick, which they did in 2014. 2015, Candlestick Park was torn down by Lennar Corporation to be a housing and industrial commercial complex. It's still empty land. Super Bowl came back. Super Bowl 19 had been at Stanford, came back to Levi Stadium in 2016. That's the Blue Angels flying over the stadium at the beginning. And the college football playoff national championship game was played there in 2019. Also in 2019, the Raiders played their last home game. And that ends my presentation and my voice.
Thank you very
So
much.
if there are any questions, be happy to answer them. I know it's long, a lot of information.
Wow, I particularly the discussion of the history of the electronics in what became known as Silicon Valley, I found that absolutely fascinating. As far as I could tell, you had your presentation had at least two distinct parts, and the only connection I could see between the two was the naming of the grid on a microchip for gridiron, a football term. So I'm wondering what, in your mind, connected the two, the sports side of your presentation, which could have been its entire presentation unto itself, with the other side of it.
Well, it was actually, yes, there are a couple of little crossovers, but yeah, you are correct that actually I didn't even think of the grid thing when I first put them together. So as mentioned in my one published book was Candlestick Park, about that stadium. And at the time I was also a docent at the 49ers Museum and Hall of Fame. So I have an interest in the history of sports in the Bay Area, we'll say. And so that I just sort of like kept adding, like building the stories of stadiums and then the colleges and whatnot. But really the other side, the reason for the history of technology is a book that I'll probably never write, but is always in my mind. I'm sure a lot of us have that. Was the story of the Cold War, but as it took place here in California or Northern California. Um, Obviously, as you saw, there are all these aerospace companies here and whatnot, and so this was a prime part of the Cold War, and also the most active Russian consulate for spying after New York and Washington was in San Francisco. So I have this idea of writing a book, and so in order to sort of establish in my mind what's the history, how did we get to where Lockheed is here and Ford Aerospace and all is, so I started researching that history, and usually working backwards, and you're ending up back at the beginning of the century. So I built that timeline, which, like I said, starts early on, and is a sort of a continuous arc with a change from tubes from arc to vacuum tubes to microwave tubes to aerospace to computers, and now we're sort of into that software and whatnot. So that's where that timeline came from. And then as you build the one on football, well, now you're telling the story of the history of the colleges, and they're a very important part of the technology side. Certainly Stanford, it's readily obvious. Um, there was an article in today's paper. San Jose State is now considered the ninth best school for coding, for teaching coding. So San Jose State has always been a important part of the Silicon Valley, not necessarily the big names, the Jerry Yangs and the Sergey Brins and those guys. A lot of the grunt engineering is done by San Jose State and Santa Clara students and whatnot. And Cal certainly has their contribution in across the board in engineering and business and whatnot. So the story of college is tied to the technology, and football's a kind of a part of college. I mean, it's interesting that Stanford first year you're launching this brand new university, but hey, we got to have a football team. So that's just sort of a way of telling the two stories. There is a bit of crossover. Each
I think,
timeline, I think, could be its
I'm sorry.
own story. I just put them together. And maybe if you're a person who knows the technology story, you didn't know the football side or vice versa. Um,
Well, I
it
think
seemed to work, but it's probably not very explainable.
this
Okay, it was interesting to hear that Santa Clara is the oldest college in California.
Yes, it and well, College Pacific, so California Wesleyan, started the same year in Santa Clara. I mean, the one obviously Santa Clara College was part of the mission, uh, but started by the Jesuits, who did not run the mission, and California Wesleyan, which eventually became College Pacific, University Pacific, started there. One had classes first. Santa Clara had the first classes, but Wesleyan had the first charter from the state. So they sort of both consider themselves. But yes, it is interesting that the first two colleges started in Santa Clara and not elsewhere. UC was a little later, and Stanford, and then the colleges in Southern California, which they have their share, but they're really, other than USC, they're later because Southern California was slower to develop. They didn't have the most of the 19th century development in California happened in Northern California. Southern California found itself in the 20th century.
Well, I think you have more convergence than you give credit for, because what you're described in this process is the development of both football and technology centered largely around the Bay Area. And there's another one, there's a specific point of convergence, which I took note of, is that Hewlett and Packard met over football and then opened up Hewlett Packard.
Correct. I mean, they obviously were both electrical engineering students and would have met eventually anyway in their classes. I mean, it wasn't a huge department,
But give them
but it's sort of, it's kind of and it's Pop Warner, who's, one of the more famous names in that era of football, who was also innovative. I mean, if you think of Stanford as this place that gets all these patents, well, even the football coach got a patent.
Okay, we're running close to deadline. Any more observations, comments, questions?
Also, I mean, in innovation on the field, you have Bill Walsh, with the West Coast offense, who he's a graduate of San Jose State, and he coached at Stanford before the 49ers. So yes, there's innovation in equipment, there's innovation in the way the game was played. So yeah, it's just kind of people smarter than me have written well, why is the Silicon Valley here? Why is it such a fertile area for these things? Um, it just is. I mean, the weather, the mentality, people come to California because you can reinvent yourself, whether it's to be an actor or an engineer or whatever. I heard a man, I think he's a man from India. He got his degree in engineering in India and then came here, and he has started, I think it's Aruba Networks, which he eventually sold to HP. But he was asked, why did you come from India to Silicon Valley? He said, because it was my dream to start a company, and that's where you do it. And then that's modern times. So you have this whole California mentality. Other places have tried to replicate it. Boston, there's Silicon something in New York and Silicon Beach in Southern California, and everybody else wants to be what's here. I mean, it's got its good points and its bad points, obviously, but that whole idea of innovation just seems to be fertile in this area. And so the two stories sort of cross over in that sense.
It's a shame that the current administration seems determined to kill it.
Well,
Yeah, it'll survive in what form we don't know, but and it's kind of not to get into modern because who wants to do that, but I think a lot of these, when you look back at these early guys, and even, I mean, the pre-war guys like Ralph Hines and Charles Lytton and 𝘈𝘬𝘰𝘵𝘊𝘐, and then the post-war, even into Jobs and Wozniak and some of the others, they were there to make money, but they also were producing things that are beneficial to society overall. Granted, misused a lot of times. Now you sort of get this group of the tech billionaires who don't seem to have that at all. They're just in it for the money, and whatever they do they seem to have a different spin than some of the original guys, or even the guys kind of in the middle in the 70s, 80s, 90s.
Well, I think Silicon Valley has survived a lot of, and Bay Area, California generally, have survived similar, shall we say, assaults on innovation before, and we'll probably survive this one too. Okay, next month we'll have Bert Gordon talking about tourism and war, another interesting combination. So I thank you, Ted, and thank everybody for attending, and see you next month.